When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite, looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
Hey, I'm John Miller, author of The Last Manager, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Before we get started, folks, we also wanted to let everybody know that is listening to this interview. It is being recorded on the D&D Fitness Apparel line. D&D Fitness Apparel is a Memphis-based comedy and clothing startup brand that is helping you reclaim the quality gym wear that you want to have on, but also does all the talking for you because you want to be comfortable while you are there to
Pump you up!
Feel free to visit them at dndfitapparel.com. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, baseball books certainly don't get much better than this. And as an Oriole fan, personally, it's nice to see Earl Weaver finally getting his full due given. The book The Last Manager is the first major biography of legendary Orioles manager Earl Weaver, which is hard to believe, but can certainly be described as the well, I should say this instead of just blabbing. Earl would be considered the grandfather of the modern game, and certainly has a wild, thrilling, hilarious ride, as he's one of the most underrated geniuses of the game. But I have the writer John W. Miller joining us. So, good morning, John. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. I coach a high school baseball team, and our season ended yesterday, so I'm mourning the loss of my baseball team, but otherwise doing good.
Right on. And sorry to hear that with the loss of the year. But are you surprised you were the first one to come up with doing an extensive book on Earl Weaver, like I mentioned there?
Yeah, I am. He died in 2013, and Moneyball was in what, 2002 or something, and
Yeah.
uh,
He
he
was
retired.
Moneyball before Moneyball.
He was, and he retired in 1986. So there was between Moneyball and when I came along, there was like 17 years for somebody to pick it off, and nobody did. So that was surprising. And I'm a sort of an outsider. Like, I don't cover Major League Baseball as a beat. I'm not part of any organization, so I came at it from an outsider's perspective. But yeah, I mean, yeah. The answer to your question is yes. I thought somebody else would do this.
Well, here, I'll throw this in there too, as far as being an outsider. And I'll explain in a second. But to make you even more of an outsider, you were a kid that grew up in Belgium, but then
Correct.
moved
Yeah.
to Pittsburgh.
Hmm.
So I don't know how baseball is in Belgium, but the reason I could say that John is an Orioles guy is because he had family that lived in the Baltimore area.
Yeah, that's right. And
So,
I spent some summers as a kid in the 80s going to Memorial Stadium and then reading a lot of books and newspaper articles about the Orioles from Belgium and, falling in love with baseball. We had a pretty good little league in Brussels in the 80s with a lot of Americans living over there. Then I went to college in Maryland. I played baseball at Mount St. Mary's in Western Maryland.
right on. So, what was that like or can you explain the process of picking Earl as a subject to do a book on?
So I always been fascinated by him. Like, I played baseball in college, coached a lot of baseball in my 20s, and I was on staff at the Wall Street Journal when he passed away in 2013. And even though I was covering the steel industry in Pittsburgh, they knew that I was on the sports desk. They knew that I was an Orioles fan. And so they invited me to write his obituary. And so I'm writing the obituary for the Wall Street Journal. And I'm thinking, how has nobody done a book treatment of this guy's life and explored his ideas and where they came from? And so after I left the Wall Street Journal 3 years later, I was looking for a big project. And because I'd written the obituary, I kind of knew the structure of his life. And I had ideas about how to tell the story. And so that really got the ball rolling.
And talk about a life, because here's a guy who grew up in St. Louis in that neck of the woods and was certainly of the street culture. Uh, Supposedly, I'll say, uncle was tied to the mob. Dad was also involved with the baseball team out there where they even had their own band. But, Earl, as I should say, also had an alcohol problem, but he also, yeah, there was so much complexity to Earl when you think of a life story. And I'm glad if anybody got to tell the story, it was you as an Oriole guy.
Oh yeah, I mean that's what makes him so interesting. I mean the book is possible because he was a winner and because he was such a great character. But what makes it
Mhm.
a fascinating human story is that he had all these sides to him. There was a violent streak that came from his uncle. Like you said, he came from the street culture. He did not go to college, but he was very, very smart. He understood probability theory intuitively through the prism of gambling, of hanging out with his uncle, who was a bookie. He was very funny. He was very charming. Also had a dark side, drank too much. I mean, players had to wrestle with his complexity. They got used to picking him up off the floor of hotel lobbies at 3 in the morning. But then they had to follow his orders the next day. So how does a guy like that become a great leader is one of the questions I pose in my book. And at the end of the day, like I on the balance, found myself liking Earl more than detesting him. I mean, it would be hard to write a book about somebody that you didn't like. And I think his qualities outweigh his flaws. And he had this great underdog kind of charm that represented Baltimore in a way that made him a folk hero there. Standing up to people or the players, teams in Boston and New York. And so, yeah, great underdog hero with a lot of complexity in his character.
And you just didn't call him Mickey Rooney. So that's all I'll say about that. Uh,
He
yeah, we'll
preferred
leave
he,
that.
he, prefer, he preferred to be called Son of Sam, which is the name of a famous serial murderer killer in
Hmm.
the 70s.
Yep. That's why I was going to leave things at bay, but yeah, that's good for folks to know. But you mentioned about the players, and it's amazing guys like, Jim Palmer, Frank Robinson, Eddie Murray, Cal Ripken, just down the line. They had the respect for him, but there was also a complexity to Earl, if I remember reading this right, because we know everything online is true. And there was possible concerns with racism and things like that. So even with Earl's faults in whatever aspect we look at and we've talked about, why do you think everybody seemed to respect him from a player standpoint?
Because he was a winner and because he pushed players to be the best they could be. And he really you brought up race. He really evolved from a environment where there was a lot of prejudice when he was a young person to commanding the respect of players like Reggie Jackson, Frank Robinson, Eddie Murray, other African American superstars. All came to love him because he was he could be hard to handle, but he was there to push you to be the best player you could be. And so at the end of their seasons and careers, players will look up and say, "Well, that guy was a handful, but." Man, I had the best year of my life playing for that guy. So that's what made him a great manager and a great leader. And players, when they left the Orioles organization, grumbling about how hard it was to play for him, would after a couple of years say, "Man, like this new manager, like he's kind of soft. He doesn't push me to be the best I could be." And so people want that kind of leadership. They want that kind of structure. They want that kind of boss who really cares about how well they do and pushes them to excel, to be the best they can be.
And perfect example with the racism side of things, you know, like he helped Frank Robinson get his, an early managing career. And the other thing that stands out, because like I said, I'm a bit of a homer, I guess you could say, as far as being an Oriole guy, even though I live in the Philly area, is he put his job on the line to help Eddie Murray go up to the club. And he started as a DH, etc.,
Hmm.
during that Rookie of the Year campaign.
Hmm.
But, Earl wasn't afraid to say, "Hey, I like this guy, I can use him." And they told
Hmm.
him, "Okay." Can you tell that story or those stories?
Yeah, so I mean, Eddie was a young prospect the Orioles drafted. Despite scouting reports that described him as being kind of lazy, they figured out he actually had a very high motivation and drive, but he wasn't an extrovert, and so he kind of flew under the radar. In spring training in '77, he was 21 years old, and the general manager Hank Peters wanted to keep him in AAA to not bring him up to the Orioles. And Earl said, if he's not going north with the team, I'm not going. So he basically threatened to quit unless Eddie was promoted to the big league club. Kind of counterintuitively at that time, the designated hitter rule is only 4 years old, and most teams would have a guy past his prime in his 30s be the DH. And Earl used the DH slot to break in Eddie Murray to give him the task of hitting every day without the pressure of also fielding. And so with that kind of structure, Eddie was Rookie of the Year, hit 28 home runs, and embarked on one of the greatest careers in baseball history. And then in his Hall of Fame speech, thanked and credited Earl Weaver for giving him that boost as a young man. And then later, Eddie Murray became a Gold Glove first baseman, but it took that kind of slow baptism via the DH rule to give him that boost. And with Frank Robinson, I mean, Frank always dreamed of becoming baseball's first black manager, which he eventually did become in 1975, exactly 50 years ago. But it's unlikely he would have gotten there as fast if Earl hadn't stuck his neck out and got him a job managing the Santurce Crabbers, a winter ball team in Puerto Rico, the team that Roberto Clemente played for. And Earl had been the manager, and he got Frank gave Frank that job when he took over the Orioles. And then gave interviews over the years saying, this Frank Robinson guy, he should be a manager. He's better than, say, Ted Williams, who had just been hired as manager of the Senators. And so Earl, helped both those guys advance in their careers. And it's a remarkable part of his story because you see him as kind of the cartoonish, clownish. He's yelling at umpires. He's a showman. But he actually had a lot of depth and a lot of concern and care for people he cared about, like Frank Robinson and Eddie Murray.
Yeah, and I also think of the Jim Palmer story because he grew up, with money in the family, etc.
Hmm.
And like I said, Earl was a street kid per se with the street culture. So two
Hmm.
different, personalities, two different structures growing up, etc.
Yeah.
But, Jim also speaks of reverence of Earl as well. Why do you think that was? Because obviously that wasn't a race thing or a culture thing
Yeah, I
or
mean they
whatever.
they clashed. They were, I call them, the famous frenemies. I mean they clashed like father and son, eternally, endlessly. Even though they were both so successful. I mean Jim won the most games of any pitcher in the American League in the '70s, and Earl won the most games of any manager. But even for all that success, I mean, at the top of the baseball world, top of the sports world, they always bickered, and they couldn't stay at peace. But at the end of his career, I mean, when Earl died, Jim talked to his obituary and talked to his funeral and talked about it being like a love affair, were the words he used. And I think they loved each other genuinely, and they needed each other in a way to be as successful as they were. They were. Kind of necessary. I mean, Jim needed somebody who was that tough, and Jim lost his father as a boy, so
Yes.
he needed the father figure to push him, and Earl needed talent, and he needed players who were cared about excellence and cared about the craft of baseball, the craft of winning baseball games, and so Jim was that, and so they both shared that love of the craft and that love of winning, and that's what kept them together for so long. And it's such an important story that Jim wrote a whole book about it called "Together We Were 11'9".
So I would say probably one of the other big moves from a player and game aspect. And I always loved when Jason Kendall told me and was explaining a game within a game when his book came out, you know, 8 years ago, whatever it was. But that move being that moving Cal Ripken, who was what, 6'4", 6'5", to shortstop, which you didn't see bigger guys or bigger frame guys at the time move to shortstop. Would you
Yeah,
agree that was probably one of the how it changed the game moving forward?
yeah, because not only did he do it, but Cal became so successful, as a hitter. But people forget that Cal was also an incredible fielder and a Gold Glove fielder and set records, fewest errors in a season, most assists, that kind of thing. And so not only did it sort of work in general, it worked spectacularly well. So it was the move that showed that a tall, big, heavy guy could be not just a shortstop, but the best shortstop. And so that did pave the way for guys like A-Rod and Troy Tulowitzki, people like that to become starting shortstops and all-star shortstops in the big leagues. And now you have 6'7" shortstops like Ellie De La Cruz in Cincinnati.
So when you think about managers, it's back in the day when Earl was coming up, and obviously he had personality, and the arguments are famous and all that fun stuff. But it seems like in today's game, managers may not be as well known or also have as much stroke as an Earl would have, a Sparky Anderson, a Jim Leland, you know, etc. Uh, when do you think that changed within the game?
I think with free agency, when the balance of power shifted towards the players, because not only were they making a lot more money than managers, so that in a kind of very, it's a very hierarchical, status-based culture in Major League Baseball. So if you're kind of the alpha, you make the most money, you kind of have sway over a group of men, and not only that, but teams had to start being nice to players in a way they hadn't before, where if you didn't coddle players, they would choose somewhere else to go play. So gradually that eroded the power of the manager. I mean, Bobby Valentine told me when he was in the major leagues, he was demoted one time because the manager didn't like the angle of his feed on a double play. Bobby was a shortstop. He didn't like the exact way he flipped the ball. And so boom, he's gone to AAA. And that would never happen these days. You'd have like an agent on the phone, you'd have other conversations. And managers told me about this, like Brian Snitker. He said, he doesn't even yell at players anymore because they just can't handle it, and it's just the culture has changed. And Brian told me, he's like, when I played high school football, a coach kicked me. So there's this other culture that these old guys came out of that doesn't exist anymore, of real hierarchy. I mean, managers in the '70s would threaten players with their fists. I mean, Billy Martin famously fought Reggie Jackson on national television in the dugout, fists flying, for not I forget, like not running out a ground ball or something. And so yeah, now you have managers more as middle managers. They're in part of these sprawling org charts. I mean, they travel with 75 or 80 people, different coaches, analysts, mental skills trainers. In the old days, it was 25 players, 5 coaches and a manager, and the manager was the absolute boss. He had more power than the GM. So free agency, and then the rise of analytics. So people like Billy Beane being the big stars. General managers now make more money. They have more power. Their roster construction abilities are prized as the essential ingredient. But that can break down too. I mean, look what's happened in Baltimore now with Mike Elias, the Orioles GM, has kind of lost control of the team and the narrative, and the team needs leadership, and the manager Brandon Hyde's been fired, and nobody's quite sure what to do. And so you have a vacuum of leadership and power there. That I think is the risk of the new approach of having the manager being kind of like a middle manager.
Yeah, I also think of with the change of culture, and it just popped in my head when you were answering there's a famous argument per se in the Philadelphia area with Dallas Green when he was still managing the Phillies. I believe it was in like 81. And there was some young reporter that asked a question named Jason Stark.
Mhm.
And it was just one of those that it caught, Dallas at the right time or the wrong time, but it was a good question. He even said after the fact, it was but boom. If something like that happened today, he would have been fired.
Mhm.
So, it's definitely a different era for sure. But before I let you go, I'm curious to know you've reported from 6 different continents. Try this in English. More than 40 countries for the Wall Street Journal. You worked for Time, NPR, the Baltimore Sun. Are you still contributing to the American magazine?
Yeah, that's my main outlet now is America. It's a monthly magazine, and I freelance here and there for other publications. But yeah, I coach high school baseball. I write for American Magazine, and then I do other projects like the book and other freelance work.
So with your years of reporting and everything, and every place you've been, what would you say the most interesting thing is being able to cover things, but also with that being said, print journalism is such a scarce thing now. Obviously, the thing with newspapers, that's one thing, but what would you say the most interesting topic is that you've covered? But also, like I said the there's just a lot there, so
Well, thank you. Well, I'm 47, so I'm old enough to have experienced a little bit of the glory days of print journalism. And I'm somebody who grew up in Belgium, loving American news, not just journalism, but American newspapers. So places like the Wall Street Journal and New York Times and Washington Post. And I was lucky enough to work for the Wall Street Journal for 13 years. So, I mean, covering the World Cup in South Africa and the Tour de France bicycle race in France were highlights. But the story that really stuck with me, I did a story about a Dutch man who was blind who went to the pilgrimage site Lourdes hoping to get a miracle and get his sight back, and he didn't. But he made a lot of friends. It was kind of about the human miracle of friendship and how we have to deal with reality. And sometimes we can't get the big thing we want, but we get something else. So yeah, the Wall Street Journal had this front page feature column, which I wrote for a lot, which allowed me to tell human stories like that one.
And you are the founder of moundsville.org. So how would you describe that website?
Yeah, so my idea was, in 2016 there was a big election and lots of kind of bitter national political discussions centered around the Rust Belt, and I was living in Pittsburgh. So my idea was to chronicle a small Rust Belt town, but take out the divisiveness of national politics and talk about the people in the town and what it was like to lose their factories and lose their jobs and how they were building a new future, in a post-industrial landscape where you don't have the big factories that have 1,000 jobs to employ everybody in the town. So tell the human stories again without the kind of distraction of national politics.
Right on. Well, the book is The Last Manager, How Earl Weaver Tricked, Tormented, and Reinvented the Baseball Game. The author, John W. Miller. John, thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Very good questions. Thank you.
Hey folks, looking for the ultimate destination for the nerd enthusiasts and collectors? Well, we found the spot for you. Nerds Nest Collectibles is a haven for nerds, geeks, and fans alike, as they have many different products and certainly more to come. Make sure you go ahead and visit them at nerdsnestcollectibles.com. Check them out.
Hi, I'm Victor Miller, and I was Jason's father, and I wrote Friday the 13th. I got 3 Emmys, 4 Writers Guild Awards, spent a lifetime in television, and have not regretted it one bit. But go to Crazy Train Radio. If you can say it, find it. Don't miss it, because if you miss it, you will have lost an incredible adventure.